The motion here in this House today is this House would ban websites that facilitate suicide. Now I call upon the Prime Minister, DJ, to open the case for the affirmative bench.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now, our motion today is this House believes that we should ban websites that facilitate suicide. Now, first of all, I'd like to limit this motion to Korea and Japan. And what do we mean by this motion? By facilitate, we mean that we would facilitate procedures for Now, we believe that such websites should be banned, and we propose that instead of these websites, servers should redirect people who attempt to access these sites to sites that have help hotlines on the telephone and that have suicide prevention information. Now, why do we think this is necessary? We have 3 reasons. First of all, we believe that suicide facilitated in websites is particularly significant in these countries. Second of all, we believe that these websites are support groups. They not only provide information, but they help people get together and commit suicide. Now, thirdly, we believe that the youth are particularly susceptible to these websites. So, I would like to move on to my first constructive point, that suicide is a significant problem in the countries of Korea and Japan. We can see that it is a unique problem. We can see that suicide happens, especially facilitated suicide, happens very often in these countries. We can see that there is social pressure unique in these countries. We see that people, they prefer to die and carry their shame with them than to live with shame. We can see the examples of politicians in Korea. Every year, several politicians make attempts to jump off high bridges over the Han River in order to get rid of their political disgrace. They jump off bridges, they jump off high buildings. This happens every year. We can see in Japan that there is a ritual that accompanies suicide, seppuku. People still try to do this. We can see that there is a tradition in this direction of committing suicide, and we can see that this tradition is continued. We can see in Korea that people, they meet on these suicide sites, and they go down to the country and drink pesticides together. This is a very real and severe problem in these countries of Korea and Japan. Second of all, we can see that the websites, they provide information on how to do things, and they are also support groups. These people, people can commit suicide without the aid of these websites. But these websites are a tool. They make it easier. They facilitate these people meeting together. These are support groups. These people who have never known each other before, they meet each other on the websites, and they support each other in their decision to commit suicide. They encourage each other to make such a decision. We can see that it would be much, much harder for these people to commit facilitated suicide if these websites were banned. We think that it is necessary to take away the ability of these websites to do such a thing. These people would have a much more difficult time, I repeat, in committing suicide were it not for these websites. So we believe that these sites should be banned, and we believe that these unfortunate people should be redirected to sites that have help hotlines, that have information on how not to commit suicide. And then I would like to move on to the third point. The point that the point that the youth are particularly at risk for these websites. The young people, they are not able to put things in perspective yet. They don't have the experience necessary. They think that, oh, there's this failure, and just because I committed this failure, I'm a failure too. They lack the experience needed to put things in perspective. We can see that in Korea and Japan, because of the difficulties, the academic difficulties involved in going to college or studying in college, that there is very much pressure upon the young people of these countries. We can see that there are students, high school students, young people who have just finished high school. They took their high school the exam to enter college, and maybe they didn't do well. Maybe they failed it. Maybe they aren't able to go to the college that they've always wanted to go to, the college that their parents and society expect them to go to. And they think they're a failure. So they go on these websites and they meet other people like themselves. And they go together to a remote place in the country and commit suicide together. And we think that this is very sad. And we think that this sort of thing ought to be prevented. We believe that especially because these young people have their whole future ahead of them, because they have many years yet to contribute to society, that it's such a pity that this sort of thing goes on, that these valuable contributors to society have to be cut off when they're so vulnerable. We believe that therefore these websites should be banned. So, Madam Speaker, what have we told you today? We have told you that this side of the House would ban websites that facilitate suicide, that instead we would redirect them to places that would give them help. We say that especially this is a significant problem in countries like Korea and Japan, that this is a social problem with deep roots. We have also told you that not only do these websites provide information on committing suicide, but that they help people meet up with like-minded people, and that these people actually encourage each other to commit suicide. We have told you that especially the youth of Korea and Japan are at risk, and that because they are our future, and because they are particularly susceptible, that we need to protect them, and therefore we beg to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Now we call upon the first negative speaker, Logan, to deliver the 8-minute speech.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, let me share with you that I have often contemplated suicide, especially at times when the beer runs out and I run out of money and the bar's closed. But jokes aside, it is a very, very important issue. We don't think that the issue of kids committing suicide is something that we would like to encourage or support in any way. But neither do we think that their policy actually works. What we think what banning websites, suicide-related websites does is, it does more harm than good, in the sense that you clamp down on the freedom of expression, which is bad, and is counterproductive, and harms, and in fact makes it even more difficult for us to monitor the situation. The approach that we want to talk about, ladies and gentlemen, is how we can actually utilize information existing on the net that makes itself evident through these websites in dealing with the problem, and putting more of an incentive and focus and responsibility on the shoulders of parents, people within this life, the children and parents, friends, people within that social circle, and say it's a responsibility of everyone to look out for someone who is, who you think might or might not commit suicide. I'll be talking about the direct detriments, especially in regards to freedom of expression, and how it will be counterproductive. My second speaker will be talking about the approach that we should take in addressing the issue, how we can utilize information, and how we can talk about parents. But before that, I'm going to address some of the issues that came on the speech from the affirmative on 4 levels. Firstly, let's look at their setup and what they want to talk about. They said, talk about websites that talk about that have the procedures for committing suicide. Firstly, we think they haven't really talked a lot about the feasibility of how this is going to work. And we think banning stuff on the internet is already notoriously difficult. Because we think the only thing worse than completely banning it is pseudo-banning it, which just pushes these sites further underground and draws way more attention to the issue, and that's something I'll be talking about. But we said, if you really talk about procedures, people don't really need to know the procedures of committing suicide. Suicide isn't really very, very complicated. But when the speaker went on further to talk about how this is such a big deal in terms of culture and politicians jump off the hand river all the time and it comes in the media, then we think people know about suicide and know how to commit these methods of suicide. It's not like you have to do something new and interesting every time. Just do what the last politician did, Mr. Speaker. And we say in that situation, it doesn't really work. But we think you piss people off even more if you send a very depressed, suicide-oriented person to a helpline, hotline website. That's like sending someone who's looking for porn to the Vatican City webpage. And what that does is, ladies and gentlemen, yes, it is a shame. Because what then you do is that you trivialize the issue. Now, if these people were looking for help in the kind of help that you think they want, a readily available suicide hotlines websites, they would have gone that way, that direction already. But if they had gone that direction and not received the help that they wanted there, and then looked into in other aspects, in other areas, what you then do is make people even more upset. You push them into an even smaller corner. Because now people who can't even, you don't even let them find like-minded people to talk about something. And we say that means that you're trivializing their issues furthermore. So on the second level, we spoke about the problem, how it's very significant, spoke about the youth, and spoke about how those things are a tool. Firstly, we said, the whole notion about the culture and social pressures and shame, we said, yes, that's a very important issue, but needs to be addressed specifically and separately in a different way. Because these things are not really website related. Those politicians didn't kill themselves because of that website. And my second speaker was talking about how we can look at those problems. When we talk about the youth, we say, yes, it is indeed very, very sad that these things are happening. But again, all the issues that you spoke about, things to do with their lifestyle, things to do with their schoolwork, are not issues that come from the fact that you have these websites. And we say again, how much difference does these websites make? And finally, this notion of a tool, we said, it facilitates it. We said, yes, it also facilitates discussion. And I'm going to talk about how that's very, very important. Let me talk about this notion of the freedom of expression, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, on 3 levels. Firstly, I'll talk about the distinction of that speech and that act. Secondly, I'll say how it's an indicator of societal interest. And thirdly, I'll talk about people who are generally interested in it, who need an avenue to talk about these things and not just make the focus about the children. Now, the distinction between the speech and an act. These people who are talking about these things, who have these websites, who are legitimately discussing these issues and providing a forum, haven't done anything wrong. They haven't killed anyone. They haven't harmed anyone. They're talking about something, and they have not shown a direct link between the talk of that discussion and that act of that thing happening. It's like having a discussion about rape or having rape fictional fantasy, Mrs. Speaker. And you say there's lots of instructional information you can get from those issues, but does that act amount to the act of committing rape? And we say there is no distinction between those two things. So you're punishing someone for not doing anything fundamentally wrong, and we think that's bad. That's clamping down on the expression of people. And why that is also further bad is because, or even more worse, is because these issues, or the fact that people can talk about these issues on the internet, or can form their little identities, is an important indicator of societal change and societal ideas. Changes in society, ladies and gentlemen, have always happened on the fringe of society, in the area where people are not sure, where people think these things might potentially be bad. Literature that's most influential has also been on the fringe, things like Lolita, etc., etc. And we say that's very important to continue. Why? Because of the needs of the people who want to talk about these things, who want to express themselves in this way. Now they talk about people who are suicidal or potentially suicidal and say they're very depressed, they feel lots of pressure. Well, that's also because they aren't allowed to develop their own forms of identities. Students who feel like I only need to be a student and I don't have any time to do the things that I want to do. People who don't fit within the regular schematic of society, ladies and gentlemen, we think that's bad. And people have needs to develop themselves. Now, a lot of people visit this website, and they haven't even told us how many of the people give us actual correlation, but we'd say that not a lot of the people who visit the website actually go on then to commit suicide. Many of the people who visit the suicide, we'll acknowledge, might be depressed, might be looking for something new, but they find these things in these discussion forums and in these boards, and then do not commit suicide, ladies and gentlemen. And we say that is a fundamental role. It's also fundamentally important that people who want to express themselves in these ways, the people who start these websites very often also walk on the border of suicide, fundamentally, or generally tend to be a little suicidal themselves. And this is an avenue for them to express themselves. And banning and clamping down on these websites, ladies and gentlemen, hampers the needs, hampers the place for these people to talk about these things, and we think that's fundamentally bad. Secondly, we say it's counterproductive. Why? Because they haven't explained the feasibility and how this is going to happen. And so if you do this, what that will cause is that it wouldn't really eradicate the people who want to commit suicide. It'll just push them further under the radar. The groups of people will still click together and still exist. They'll just be harder to find, just be harder for the states to look at them, and just be harder for us to do anything about them. And what we say that this is, it creates a panacea. It creates this idea that we are doing something, but we're not actually doing anything. What we are doing is further marginalizing these people, is criminalizing the behavior of talking about suicide, criminalizing the behavior of feeling like you want to commit suicide, and we say that's bad. That makes already antisocial people who are already very depressed, furthermore depressed. And we say what this also does is it falsely establishes these sites as parts of popular culture. And we know how banned items tend to attract people who just want to be rebels. And we think that's also bad. So in all, ladies and gentlemen, what they're doing in today's debate, the proposal that they're giving us, does more harm than good. Why? Because it doesn't actually address the situation. We just address the situation of people who are depressed, who do feel shame, who have many incentives, many reasons to commit suicide. What it does is, it makes it hard for people in this area, in this social group, to talk about the things that are depressing them. And we say by pushing these people further underground, by marginalizing them, by criminalizing them, by eradicating their freedom of expression and speech, what you might do is just push them to that brink, push them to that edge of that cliff, and make them commit suicide. We say that's bad. For all those reasons, we're very happy to oppose this debate.
Thank you, Leader of the Opposition. Now we cross back to the government bench and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister, Jason. You're here.
I believe Karl Rove and the Republican administration in the United States would love Logan because he is just like them. He's an exercise in circular logic throughout his speech. His analysis is that you don't want to give people who want to commit suicide helplines because that might depress them. Fascinating. Sending someone to counselors will encourage them to commit suicide instead of encouraging them not to commit suicide. I'm not really sure what world this works in, but perhaps you do have a future as a speechwriter for George. Now, I think that we have a couple of arguments that will devastate the claims that they're making. I will start with some refutation of some of Logan's arguments, and I'll continue on to our new material, which is the special government role that the government has in facilitating and dealing with these sorts of problems. Now, he says we shouldn't, I want to deal with a couple of things. Logan says early on it's not feasible. I would suggest that's not true, and even if it is, as long as we stop, this will be our claim, is that if we stop one suicide, we have a comparative advantage over the status quo. That's all I need. I just have to win that one kid tries to go to that website, doesn't meet anyone, and then they live. And we have a net beneficial reason to vote for us. And I think we can compare that to the minor loss of rights, which is inevitable in the status quo anyway, that you will then vote for the proposition. Now, he says it's not feasible. Well, that's not true because you regulate things on the internet all the time. Korea regulates pornography on a regular basis. It limits the amount of pornography in this country, and that is certainly an example of how it works. And besides the fact that as long as they get redirected to some other site, who cares if other people break the law and then go and create bad websites? That doesn't mean that we don't have a comparative advantage of the status quo, and we think that's enough to win. Now, he says sending them to a helpline is bad because they won't find like-minded individuals. And then they will not do what? They won't be able to express themselves. Well, I think it's safe to say that I've seen deeper analysis in George Bush press conferences. I don't think there's a whole lot going on with this argument. The suggestion here is that, sure, they won't find like-minded individuals. We think that's good, because what they do is they go and look for these people. They want to have a group of people to commit suicide with. This is the empirical examples that Doomji talks about, that in the status quo, this is what people do. They want the encouragement to commit suicide, so they look for other people who are equally depressed, who are not comfortable with themselves, and they go out and commit suicide as a group. We think that's good. Thank you, Logan. We agree with you. They won't find like-minded individuals. They will, however, find counselors, and this is the unique difference between the status quo and us. We're going to direct them to helplines. Now, his claim has to be that those counselors are incompetent, or they will not encourage these people to not commit suicide. Our claim will be that's probably not true, and even if they don't save every life, they'll save some, and that's on balance a reason to vote for us and not a reason to vote for them. Now, he says freedom of speech. I got a big stack for this one. First, excuse me, he says there's no direct link between the status quo and these websites. That's not true. Doomji already answered this argument when she explained these people are in fact looking for people so they can commit suicide in groups. This is happening in Korea on a regular basis. The social pressures she talks about that he mocks demonstrate the reasons why they are looking for this help to do it. They're looking for how to do it quickly. They're looking for groups they can do it with, and this is exactly the point. Now, additionally, he makes an analysis to rape. He makes an analogy to rape. He says, well, you're criminalizing people's speech, and just because someone talks about rape doesn't make them a rapist. Well, I think that we found a website that was encouraging people to go out and do gang rapes so they could find groups of people to do gang rapes with. We might want to close that down. Our claim is that it's illegal to commit suicide, and when these people look to commit that crime, A, it's a crime, so there's a legal justification for doing it, and I'll get to that in a moment. But B, when they're doing this, they're also hurting themselves and they're hurting the group, so there is a special interest in taking this action. And I think that the analogy falls in upon itself to that extent. Next, he says that expression is good. We increase depression. Well, that's all answered above. And I would point out to Logan, you have no identity when you're dead. There's not a whole lot that you're going to be able to... My identity in a coffin is not quite as cool as my identity when I'm speaking and debating and participating in society, and that is exactly why Doomji makes the argument about the youth. Now, I think at this point it's safe to say their argument here is worse than Omar modeling in Speedos. You wouldn't want to see it, you wouldn't want to buy it, and you sure wouldn't want to tape it. Now, he says, and finally, I'll make a couple of arguments about free speech, and you can group these as a box. Call it new material, call it my responses, I don't care. First is there's always limits to free speech. They can never identify a true society which has no limits on free speech. You cannot go into a building that's crowded and yell fire because people will die. There are ratings on television and film because we need to protect people from certain types of information, and society makes those decisions. Also, pornography is heavily regulated in most societies, certainly in these. Additionally, you cannot incite riots whenever you want to, just like you shouldn't be able to encourage people to kill themselves just because he thinks you have a right to free speech. Additionally, there are libel laws. Society regulates free speech on a daily basis. There are no absolute freedoms, and I do not think they will win this argument. Additionally, Korea bans internet pornography. There's already a justification for internet censorship in the status quo, which demonstrates we are not on balance worse than anything that happens now. Finally, there is no absolute freedom. All kinds of freedoms are limited. You can't do drugs when you want to. If you want to beat Logan over the head because you think he looks funny, you can't do that either, even if you think it's justified. There are all types of limits on freedom every day. No one lives in an anarchistic free society, and you wouldn't want to. That's why we have the government to make certain laws. Now, special government role are additional new information. First, we will say that the government has two reasons why this is true. There is a special role for the government to take action here. The first of these is that it's self-preservation. The second is that there's a legal justification for taking action. The government must help. The societal reasons that Doomji talks about when she suggests there are unique social pressures on young children in these Asian communities and on the politicians to not live with their shame represents social problems that the government has an obligation to do something about. In this case, it may represent a small loss of freedom, and we're willing to take that risk in the event that we protect lives in the future. And, more importantly, we need to encourage these cultures to start dealing with their shame, because this is not a reasonable solution to having personal shame. You know, sometimes people fail, and in these societies they are so intense and so high pressure that people don't have outlets for ways to deal with their problems. We would suggest that self-preservation alone suggests that the government has a unique, special interest to do something about this, and certainly suicide prevention hotlines are a reasonable alternative to encouraging people and facilitating, and this is the key thing, these websites facilitate suicide. They don't just talk, and this is the unique argument that Doomji has already explained earlier. Now, second reason the government has a unique social role is because it's illegal. When the government sees illegal activity, they usually step in. That's why you have a government. That's why you don't have an anarchistic, free-for-all society. So that might be more entertaining on a regular basis. Nonetheless, in this situation, there is a unique opportunity for the government to do something about it. When people commit suicide, they're breaking the law. Now, I'll be willing to admit that I think that's kind of a bizarre law, but nonetheless, the government generally does regulate people who break laws. And in this situation, these websites, much like rape, are creating situations where people can regularly break the law. And at a very minimum, from a social roles perspective, that's what the government does. They step in situations like this, they fix these problems, and I think in this situation, they don't have much of a leg to stand on in suggesting the government shouldn't take action when it's got to protect its kids. Much like Whitney Houston, I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. Show them all the beauty they possess inside. Give them a sense of pride. Right? We love the children. We want them to teach the future. Well, that sounds terrible. But we want them to have a future at least. They got no identity when they're dead. I challenge them to explain what sort of self-identity these people are going to create when they have no life and they are dead in their coffin. I think our arguments are overwhelming and that you will vote for the proposition.
I thank Deputy Prime Minister for his contribution. To extend the opposition's case, let me invite Jiu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members of the House. I'm sure a person like Jason wouldn't have a problem of thinking of committing suicide because there's so many friends around him, like all our debaters we see here today. But these are not the cases for people who go to these websites to actually contemplate about suicide. And I'll elaborate that later on. Jason said that these sites encourage people to get together. Jason said that these sites encourage suicide. But he does not take into account that what they want is not encouragement. What they want is empathy. What they want is feelings of sharing. What they want is sympathy. Why can you not take it into account that these are what people want and not just encouragement? No one here wants to, honestly, no one in the world wants to die. That's why when people often commit suicide, when they jump off a roof, they leave their shoes because they want to leave a trace that they existed. No one honestly wants to die in this world. And this is what Jason wants us to assume, that everyone who goes on these suicide websites want to actually die. Now, moving on. He puts in the assumption that everybody who goes on a suicide is actually thinking death from the beginning. But that's not the case. They go there to talk. They go there to associate themselves with people. I'll talk later in my speech why association is also important. They talk about, if they make friends, how we'll overcome this situation. But he does not attack the root cause of the problem. The root cause is that these people have no friends. These people are loners. These people do not have a chance to associate themselves or rent. And that's why these people go to these hotlines. And that is exactly why Logan talked about that redirection would not work. Because that will have to work on the assumption that if they are redirected, they will have to look at the website. But that is just an assumption. Because of that one boy, the comparative advantage Jason talked about, you're sacrificing 10 other girls who might be killing themselves. If they rented, they would not have died. And that is what Jason wants to propose as a government side. Now, moving on to my substantial speech, I'll talk about how you can utilize these sites to actually better the situation. And secondly, I'll talk about the government's responsibility for awareness, not clamping down on freedom of speech. First of all, these sites could be utilized to actually help these students, or these adults, or these students. And what they do is, they reach out to them. They're not just sites about how to kill yourself. As Logan said, killing yourself is pretty easy. You just have to stick a knife. I don't hear. It's not that hard. But what they do there is not to not to train themselves how to kill better, how to have more ecstasy when you die. That's not it. They exist for them to have a space of common ground that they could talk about their marginalization, they could empathize, they could associate themselves with others. And I'll tell you why freedom of expression is so much important in this case, because if you look, clinical depression comes because often psychologists or psychiatrists will tell you because you don't rent. And that's why those psychologists and psychiatrists, they charge you $150 an hour to rent you about things. And these people go there because they don't have friends. But what about people who don't have the leisure to spend $150 an hour, like students, they want to talk about, an hour to go to psychologists, psychiatrists to rent. And that what they're doing is they're actually canceling, they're banning, they're abolishing the space for them to associate themselves with. And that's why we have internet blogs, so we call it, because we want to express ourselves. And that is just how much freedom of expression is so important. And second of all, this idea of association, because a lot of depression comes when you identify yourself that you're alone. This is the ultimate fear. We're alone in society. I don't have a boyfriend, I'm alone. That's the fear that hits you, and that's kind of fear. I don't have my parents. I'm alone in this world. I want to live in this society, but no one takes care of me. These are the problems that will make the students go to the website. And when you take away this association, when you take away this website that exists for them to calm themselves down, for them to actually rethink their path, they're actually increasing more harmful situations as Logan has talked about. And I can tell you from examples, many examples around you, that the idea of association is very important because, for example, when Koreans go abroad, we make ourselves what's called the Korean village. When Chinese go outside, we make situation what's called Chinatown. And these exist as a prime example because there is a need for you to associate yourself with somebody who's like you. And when that association doesn't exist, you sometimes fall into the existential crisis. You feel like, am I alone in this world? Do I deserve to live? Does anyone care about me? And you leave your shoes and you jump off a cliff. That's what happens when Jason cancels out those websites. Moving on to my second argument is that there is a responsibility for government to actually better the situation. Just clamping down everything doesn't work. Clamping down on alcohol in the 1960s in the United States, that did not work. Clamping down is never an answer to anything that is serious in the world or in the society. Now, there is a majority of people being students. There is a need for government to reach out to the students or parents. And there's also a site that website will provide you. Website will provide a space for government to monitor the happenings in these sites. If you take away these websites, there will be no chance for government to actually look into the psyche of these people. If these websites are gone, government cannot reach out to you as they would like to, and that is the problem that this government is proposing. And if you look at teenagers, the problem is not because they go to these sites, but it's because there's the least awareness in the society. They're not aware of themselves, or when they have parents, the parents themselves are not aware that their children are going through such hardships. And when government has these websites, they can monitor it and they can inform the parents of these children. And if they don't have that system, all they do is have this stupid commercial on hotlines, call 911 or whatever, something as equivalent and inane, and expect those students to call them. But that is never a situation, because if that has worked fine, these websites would not have existed to begin with. And that is a sign that the government is being weak, and government banning it is just a sign that they're so weak that they don't want to confront the situation. They're just going to clamp down on it. And there's another funny example why clamping down doesn't work, because I've heard it from my friend that when you go to Italy, actually drinking is legal. So nobody drinks there, everybody does drugs. That's what the government side is proposing from this debate today. Moving on, there is a responsibility for government to actually reach out to adults. I've talked about parents, but what about adults who feel alone and who feel disassociated? Just like teenagers, adults feel like they want to die too. But the problem with adults is that they're not really keen on expressing themselves. While teenagers have peer groups, especially in Korea and Japan, you have these humongous, gigantic groups of people you go to, like girls you go to bathrooms together with, just to the bathroom, not to stalls. That does not exist among adults. And that's the problem. Adults don't like to express themselves unless they're anonymous. And they're taking away that chance for adults as well as teenagers. And don't deny that adult suicide rate is also high in Korea, just as teenagers. Teenagers are not the only problem. They're taking away these chances for them to revitalize themselves and thus making the situation much worse. And now to end by saying that Doomji's first speech that all meet up and go to Hanggang and drink pesticide. That is just a worst misrepresentation I've ever seen that come up from this side of the government. And because of those simplicity, I think the opposition takes the case. So thank you.
I thank second negative. Now we call upon the third affirmative, Eleanor.
Let's not forget that what we're talking about are websites that facilitate suicide. All throughout this debate, the opposition has been primarily taking advantage of the fact by saying, look, these websites are websites that talk about suicide, forgetting the idea that they actually do facilitate suicide and provide you with support groups that actually do more than discuss or provide you with information about suicide. It's not just about free expression. It provides you with means to actually continue on with an act. So if they ask us, look, we merely want to let people talk to us about the problem in order for them to actually resolve their issues. If they don't express their problems, nothing happens. The question is the opposition actually leading you to people you can actually trust to help you solve the problem? It's Logan leading the pack, and I say we can't trust them if they say that we're going to look at these websites that we're going to ban websites that talk about facilitating suicide. Because anyway, they'll talk to us about our problems, and you're actually not going to commit suicide. You're actually just going to talk about your problems, and nothing is going to happen. But if you're going to talk to like-minded people, and people who don't have diverse opinions of how you can actually deal with your problems, how likely is it, how great is the possibility that you're actually not going to commit suicide when you look at these websites that provide you with friends who want to commit suicide? Clearly, they're leading us to the wrong sort of crowd. G talked about two things I want to rebut very, very quickly. She said that the reason why clinical depression is so very prevalent is that in these societies, you're not allowed opportunities to vent. And these websites that actually facilitate suicide allow you opportunities to vent. Yes, we agree. It allows you opportunities to vent about how you can, the many possible ways you can kill yourself, but not actually attacking the root cause of the problem. You want to kill yourself because you're depressed. You have several problems. Are these people who want to talk about ways to kill yourself the people who are actually going to tell you, it's okay, don't kill yourself, or it's not okay, just kill yourself? Clearly, that is not the case. Second, she talked about government responsibility shifting itself to the parental domain. Look, it's easier to monitor if you don't ban these websites. Parents can monitor whether or not you actually enter these websites, and therefore parents can actually help you with the problem. Look, I come from the Philippines. It's not as technologically advanced as Korea, but I'm pretty sure that even here, there's a disparity with how your parents and you use the internet. They simply do not have the same amount of technological know-how. If you want to look at websites like pornography or talk about suicide, you're not going to let your parents find out. You're going to find out ways to keep that particularly nasty habit from them. So clearly, what is the more feasible proposal? It's to go with our model to just make access as inhumanly impossible as ever. I have three issues I want to summarize in this debate. First, how exactly is our proposal going to work? Because we've been accused that it's going to be ineffective, which is clearly wrong. Second, what is actually the best approach for youth depression and suicidal thoughts? Third, I want to answer this particular question. Have these people actually committed crimes already? In responding and linking it to Jason's argument about government responsibility in making sure you provide an environment that is not conducive towards the commission of crimes. First, will our proposal work? Obviously, yes. DJ spent a lot of time talking about how specifically these servers will actually redirect you to other websites that offer you help instead of to these websites that actually tell you to go to these particular nasty websites. Servers can filter out content, and we know how effective that is in Korea and Japan. There are many websites I wanted to access from the Philippines of obviously questionable content that I haven't been able to do so in this country. Clearly, it's a feasible thing that they can actually enact. Therefore, it's something that works. Logan says that's just pseudo banning. We say no, it's effectively banning the particular websites we don't want people to access. He says we're pushing these particular websites underground, that it's difficult to monitor. We say if you push it underground and it's difficult to monitor, then to the ordinary person, even the ordinary person who wants to kill yourself, it's actually good because you make access as humanly difficult as possible. If you can't access it, the more you push it underground, because we can see it's impossible to totally eradicate something. But if you make access a particularly difficult thing to do, then we say the government has more than enough done its job. Second, what's the best approach for youth depression and suicide? We say that you should steer them away from suicide websites and actually discuss depression. We're not trivializing the problem. We're leading them to people who can actually talk to you about the problem versus letting you talk to people who will let you kill yourself right away. This means that we're talking about a government role that actually tells us that, look, this is what the government should do, should steer away its people from doing that. They say, express all you want with like-minded people. Is that going to work? We say, no. Third, have these people actually committed crimes already? Because Logan is right. These people have not committed crimes. They're merely talking about these possibilities and they're exploring means that actually make it very likely to happen. We say that this is a bad idea because you actually create an environment conducive for crime, but not necessarily an environment that is safe for everyone else concerned. This is why when Jason made a very particularly good argument about it's the government's responsibility to make sure that we ban these websites, to make it difficult for them to actually have these possibilities, we say that as much as possible, the government is providing an environment of safety and security for teenagers at a particularly vulnerable time. We've contextualized this debate far even better and understood the situation far better than they do. We know that in these societies we've chosen to talk about, in Korea and Japan, social pressures can escalate to a particular degree that yes, you'd rather kill yourself than actually face these particular failures. Which is why we say that it's up to the environment, it's up to the government rather, to create a social environment that discourages these particular societal pressures. In a sense, our proposal is culturally nuanced to combat a cultural problem that leads people to actually want to kill themselves. This is particularly the genius behind Jason's argument, which is why we say we think it provides society a far safer environment that makes it less conducive for them to actually commit crimes. So at the end of the day, on the motion that this House believes that we should ban websites that facilitate suicide, we say that we recognize that free speech may have a value. It causes changes on the fringes, as Logan may have argued earlier on. But if you create an environment where the potential actors like the youth are very susceptible towards killing themselves before any sort of particular changes on the periphery can actually take place, we say that's something that's quite illogical. You're only leading these particular actors or youth or members of society to talk to the wrong people about solving the problem. We say we agree. We need freedom of expression when you want to talk about particular problems. But we don't lead them to people who think like them. We need to lead them towards people who also understand and will tell them, it's okay. You can live with shame, you can move past it. We don't think they should have to go to these websites. It's clearly a bad idea. And for all these reasons, I'm proud to propose.
Thank you, Eleanor. We welcome the last substantial speaker, Irma.
Madam Speaker, we don't exactly call it an act of genius to make 40 seconds of your speech part of Whitney Houston's song. But basically what we don't have on the side of the government is actually proving to us that these people will go to the hotline, listen to the counselors, and let the counselors solve their problems. Because they want to talk about the benefit of the hotline and the counselors, which are actually proving us that these suicide contemplators who are thinking of suicide, who are going and typing the website without any intention of looking for those sort of people in the first place, will actually want that sort of communication at that time. So they can come up and tell us the benefits without actually proving to us that it works. I'm going to talk about two things, Madam Speaker. I want to talk about firstly who reaches out to the victim better, which is the better medium to reach out to suicide contemplators, Madam Speaker. Secondly, I'm going to talk about this whole idea of actually, is it fair for us to make this organization or group or whatever they call themselves illegal under law, Madam Speaker? Firstly, let's talk about the idea of who reaches out to the victim better. Because basically, Madam Speaker, both of us want to reach out to the suicide victim. None of us want them dead. Do we clamp down and redirect, or we let them express themselves? Now, basically their burden of saying save one person is really lame, Madam Speaker. It actually shows that they don't really know what suicide victims are all about. People don't always go for the kill, Madam Speaker. People don't always go, people who are actually contemplating suicide, it's a very hard decision to do. What actually pushes a person to go to the edge, to take a knife and put it to her neck, Madam Speaker, we really don't know. We don't know what will make a person actually commit suicide and take that final decision. But we think that it's worse. It's worse when you shut them out. Because we're both working with the same model. We're working with the person, Madam Speaker, who is contemplating suicide, moving between 50-50. Now what they're doing, by redirecting and forcing them to go to meet counselors, Madam Speaker, and make everything all happy, it won't work, we say. Because those people going online, they aren't looking for those people. They aren't looking for more people who will look at them as freaks. They aren't looking for more people who won't relate to their situation. The reason they're going online to look for suicide websites is because they want people to relate to them, who understand them. Because talking about suicide is something extremely embarrassing and humiliating. And that's why it's not something very popular, Madam Speaker. But the fact is, they want people who won't judge them, Madam Speaker, who won't call them, abnormals, and, someone who say, yes, some weird guy named Dr. Freud who tells you, yes, I understand what you're saying, move on to the next freak. They don't want that sort of person, Madam Speaker. JG has no idea about how these people really are, Madam Speaker. They will feel more lost in the situation when you redirect them to people they don't want to talk to, and they will just feel more wrong because they will type in and see that they're redirected and see, oh my God, I am a freak. I can't talk to people who are like me. We are banned. We are freaks. We are criminals, Madam Speaker. So what they have, Madam Speaker, secondly, we say that there are other positive ways to utilize websites like this. Like what? My speakers have been talking about this, and it hasn't been analyzed by the government at all. We talked about how the website is an important indicator of how the society is like at that moment. The government can't just shut down sites like this and ignore that this is an important indicator. A lot of people want to kill themselves. We are messing up. We'd better do something. Maybe have campaigns, Madam Speaker. Like in Malaysia, we have this annoying ad, Madam Speaker, in the radio all the time. Befrienders. We want to make friends. Everyone deserves a friend. Things like that, Madam Speaker. Ads and campaigns, reaching out to people, understanding that there is something and we can't simply sweep it under the rug, Madam Speaker. These sites, Madam Speaker, aren't just how to kill yourself sites. Because as Logan has clearly pointed out, it's pretty simple. It's not really that hard. You don't need a how-to step 1 to 12 of how to kill yourself, Madam Speaker. I can tell you a very pretty simple way to kill yourself, maybe cyanide in your soju. But basically, in these websites, it's about expression. It's an outcry. These people want to talk, and these people want to express themselves, Madam Speaker. The government can use this as an indicator that something is really messed up. Parents can read and know that there are some 13-year-olds out there right now who are really messed up and who have serious issues in their life, Madam Speaker. Instead of sweeping it, we can use it to our advantage. It's a medium, Madam Speaker, for us normals to see what is going on in the minds of the suicide victims, and taking it away, Madam Speaker, is simply wrong. And They said, for example, they talked about this idea of the honor code, Madam Speaker, and they said, oh, that's a blanket reason why people kill themselves. And that is an assumption made by a normal. I think, Madam Speaker, it's fair to assume that different individuals have different reasons why they kill themselves, and we can't take away the website to actually analyze these sort of different indicators. There may be an honor code in society, but the guy could also be sad because his wife is cheating on him, because he didn't get the job, and she's sleeping with the president of the company, Madam Speaker. We say with all the factors that we have talked about, their proposal is making it worse than the status quo. Secondly, let's analyze the idea of making these groups illegal, Madam Speaker. What did Jason say? He didn't say much, but he said, basically, it's good because freedom is not absolute. Now, that's not a good argument, because even though freedom is not absolute, there has to be a justification of making that freedom not absolute, Madam Speaker. Because should we make suicide groups illegal, a negative emotion, Madam Speaker, an emotion they haven't proved, the link, Madam Speaker, to prove that these suicide groups actually do make people commit suicide, Madam Speaker, they didn't prove that to us, we're actually saying expressing negative emotion in a liberal democracy is wrong. So what about sites of fat people who actually say, let's all eat and eat until we all get obese and get, really bad diseases, Madam Speaker? Because when we talk about negative emotions, it's very different from a criminal act. He brought up a very silly analogy. What was that analogy? Oh, what if rapists get together online and talk about, finding a certain venue and raping people? That's a criminal act, Madam Speaker. The police would be really happy, and those criminals wouldn't be very smart people, Madam Speaker. That's two distinct things. Making a negative emotion illegal, and that's crime, Madam Speaker. That's a crime in any country that you go, even in the most undemocratic countries, Madam Speaker. So let's go to the next idea. The second level is, Madam Speaker, we already talked about how we can actually use the sites, Madam Speaker. But the fact is, if you make it illegal, you're making it go underground. That's right, Len. Kids are more technologically advanced than their parents. It means, Madam Speaker, that if my mom, who doesn't know how to the internet, who has never used the internet before in her life, if you make it hard to access the site, that means parents won't have access to the site and won't have a medium to see what's happening with my 13-year-old, 14-year-old, or 15-year-old, Madam Speaker. You're making it worse. You're not only making the access hard for parents, you're making it hard access for society. Society should be part of the people and part of the parties trying to find out what is wrong with the suicide contemplators. Because contemplating suicide is a very, very sad thing, Madam Speaker. It's an anomaly of human beings, and we have to understand and reach out, Madam Speaker, and not shut them out. So basically, I have a few questions. Firstly, do we let them express themselves, or do we shut them out? And I think I've shown to you, Madam Speaker, that it's better to let them express themselves instead of shoving it under the rug and pretending they don't exist. Secondly, Madam Speaker, do we make them feel more criminal and wrong when we actually site illegal? We say, yes, Madam Speaker, you're making them feel worse, you're making them feel more humiliated and embarrassed, and you take away a medium for them to express themselves. Thirdly, do we actually use it positively, or do we actually just shut it up and try, some weird way to, and hope that they actually go to the councillor's site, Madam Speaker? We say it's better for us to use it positively. But lastly, have they actually proven to us that these sites are the real reason people commit suicide? I don't think so, Madam Speaker. We say the opposition wins this debate. Thank you.
I thank the negative. Now we invite the opposition reply speaker to sum up the negative bench.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, there are two aspects to this debate. Like in any debate where the government is planning to do something and take away some of people's rights. And that is, firstly, can these governments do it or not? And secondly, should these governments do it? We say, ladies and gentlemen, on both those levels, we win the debate. We said, and we held the stance very, very consistently throughout this debate. We said, banning banning websites that facilitate suicides does more harm than good. Why? Firstly, on this notion of whether governments can do it or not. This is the notion of the rights of governments to do it, and secondly, the feasibility of actually doing it. Now, of course, freedom is not absolute, but we say you have to show a direct enough link for taking away this freedom. Because we've argued also consistently that these people haven't done anything wrong. even in sites that encourage people to do criminal behavior, that encouragement is still fictional work, and you have to show that it is that encouragement indeed that caused someone to do a specific act. And that can be said as that person was an accomplice in that person committing that crime or doing that something wrong. Not a general idea, not a general discussion, ladies and gentlemen, and we say they haven't driven that hard enough. But more worrying is whether or not it will actually happen. Because we've questioned the feasibility on a technological level, and we say they've considered this somewhat in their debate also. They say kids are always more advanced, and we say yes, that's true. People who want to associate and want to discuss something, ladies and gentlemen, will continue to do this. I argued this from the start and said what you will then do is push people further underground. Not only do you now marginalize them, you criminalize this behavior. This behavior of talking about how depressed I feel and how I would like to kill myself. That's criminal behavior now, and we say that's bad. That's the harm that it causes. That's the harm that I introduced in my speech that was never addressed at any point in this debate. And that was the harm that G brought up in her speech also, how this notion of association. And that's on the second level of this debate, whether the governments should do it or not. Because that's the onus which they put for themselves. That when they're doing this, you have to have a significant difference to help people. Jason reduced it a little bit in his speech. He said, as long as we help one person, that's good enough. But he hasn't actually even showed that. But we said it's not just that notion of whether it helps that one person. There are many people who use these websites. The people who write content on these websites, the people who read content on these websites, the people who share content on these websites. We talked about how association is very, very important. And you choose yourself the levels which you associate with. And that's why the hotlines don't work. And G talked about this. Counseling doesn't work if you don't choose to go for counseling, ladies and gentlemen, because then it's just something else forced down your throat. Like the other 20 other reasons that made you want to contemplate suicide to begin with. That approach is overly simplistic in solving a problem that's very, very complicated. We said when we talked about how that's an issue that they haven't addressed on this side of this debate. If you don't allow these people to associate, why not instead use that as an avenue to learn more about the situation? People around these people have to become more directly involved. It is a very complex issue. Some of it is because of social hierarchies and structures. Some of it is because of individual problems and issues that they have at life, at work. Some of it is just people not feeling like their friends like them or love them anymore. And we said you can't just stop people from talking about these issues in different kinds of ways. Not letting them be themselves. And this notion about identity. Yes, when they're dead, they don't have an identity. But it's not having an identity when they're alive that makes them want to die. Not feeling like they can express themselves and be an individual, different human being. So that banning these websites makes it part of the problem and makes it far harder. What did we do in today's debate? We had a very consistent approach. We talked about the freedom of expression, on how these people are not doing anything wrong, and talked about it in general, how expression is an indicator of societal change and ideas, and talked about what they're doing will become counterproductive and make the problem far worse. We talked about the utilization of these sites. We talked about government responsibility and the parental roles. We talked about association. All in all, ladies and gentlemen, what you do here is if you ban these sites, is be overly simplistic and cause more harm. What we have to do is take the approach of the opposition to solve this problem. We're very happy to oppose.
Thank you for a negative reply speech. Now we invite the second affirmative speaker again for an affirmative reply speech.
After listening to the last two speakers, I think I can safely say the opposition strategy has become blame Whitey. They didn't spend one bit of their effort talking about Lynn's fantastic speech or the brilliant introduction that was given to us by Doomji. They basically ignored all of their arguments and spent a lot of time talking about me. And while I appreciate that, I don't think it's a particularly good strategy because I think Lynn's speech was fantastic, and I believe we will safely win this debate. Now, you will notice in their speeches that they have a lot of defense and very little offense. At the end of the debate, we need to win one thing. And they said, Jason's analogy is lame. Why? I said, quite frankly, I need to win that one kid or one parent or one person goes to these websites, talks to a counselor, or even just chooses not to commit suicide because they can't find a group of friends, something that's happening in the status quo, to go and do it with them. Now, that's all I need. I don't need more than that. And they may say that's lame, but I think you're trivializing the death of innocent people. That's kind of lame. And I think that our arguments are fairly compelling that we only need to get that much, because they have no counter-proposal to fix this problem. Their solution, which I will talk about later, is that depressed people should talk to other depressed people that want to kill themselves, because then they won't want to kill themselves. What? That is the circular logic that George Bush used to go invade Iraq because there were no weapons of mass destruction. It's all kinds of it's very simplistic logic to suggest that depressed people will create solutions to their depressed problems. I do think it makes a lot more sense to suggest that counselors will provide the nurturing, kind environment that these people need, which we agree about, and I think that that means you will vote for us. Now, there's a couple of areas that we agree on. First, we agree that suicide rates are high. In fact, Jean did an excellent job of explaining how politicians kill themselves just as much as young kids. We agree. That's just another reason to vote for us, not a reason to reject our proposal. Second, she says, and they say, collectively, that people need to express themselves. We agree. That's true. I don't think you need to give them sad, depressed people that want to kill themselves. I think what you want to do is provide them with outlets where counselors who are trained professionals that do know what these people are thinking, so they can talk to them. I don't know. I'm sure other depressed people don't know, but I'm pretty sure a counselor who's trained to deal with suicide, manic depressives can figure out much better than anybody else, probably most people in this room, what to do when you're talking to a depressed person that wants to kill themselves. That's logical, it's rational, it might be simplistic, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. Now, finally, we also all agree that we will not solve all of suicide. That's true. We are not a panacea. We don't claim that every person that wants to jump off the Han River Bridge is going to wake up and say, thank God they redirected me to that wonderful website so I could talk to someone. But there's a pretty good chance that a few of them will, and that's what we call the comparative advantage of the status quo. I don't have to win that I stop all of suicide. I just have to win that I create a comparatively better system and better society than one that currently exists. And I think that we've definitely done that. Now, they say there must be a justification for the proposition. There are three unique justifications for why we would want to impose upon rights in this way. First, there's unique cultural pressures in Korea. These were they were outlined by Doomji very elegantly in the first speech. Ji-yoon thankfully explains more of the cultural pressures that politicians go through. We agree those are terrible. And I think that suggests that there is a unique cultural situation in which people carry their shame to the grave because that's better than actually living without it. Now, it's true that they need to find their identity. However, the identity for people in coffins is we call them worm food. They are not, in fact, people who can actually do anything. They have no identity because they are dead. That is the point. If you want to find your identity, you need to be alive to do it, and we will claim that it's worth sacrificing a few rights to facilitate that process. Second, there's a legal justification. They claim the rape analogy is wrong. However, that's not true. If a group of people that want to gang rape somebody got on a website and collectively decided to do it, the government would step in. If a group of people want to break the law by committing suicide, the government should get together, stop that breaking of the law, and step in. It's exactly what you are talking about. We appreciate the help with the extra analogy. Finally, free speech. They concede all of my examples that free speech is not absolute in the status quo, and most of those examples are places in which the government steps in to protect society from social ills, i.e. things like pornography, things like ratings on television, things like libel, because you need to regulate free speech to make sure society works effectively. I think that means you would clearly vote for the government team.
I thank all speeches and now close this round.